Hello and good evening, everybody. Very glad to be here as part of Ignite. My talk tonight is titled The Vestigial City, and it's a talk about the history of infrastructure here in the city of San Francisco. So first, a little bit about myself. I'm the creator of an organization called the Bay Area Infrastructure Observatory, which is a mouthful, but it's basically a fan club for infrastructure. So we take on-site tours of bridges, electrical systems, nerdy stuff like that. I'll let you guys in on a secret. Basically, we started it early last year. We wanted to get into a nuclear power plant. And so we emailed them and said, could we come to the plant? They said, who are you? And he said, average citizens would love to come into the plant. To which they said, no. And then effectively an email to the effect of never, ever email us again. So we put together a nice looking website and a logo. When we called a few months later, and they said, who are you again? And we said, well, I'm deputy director of the Bay Area Infrastructure Observatory. To which they said, let us know if there's any parts of the plant you want to see. And pretty soon we were on the tour, so there's actually some images from the plant. It was designed in the 70s and turned on in the 80s, so you can see it's got this kind of great time capsule of that period. This is actually where most of your power comes from, terrifyingly enough. So today I actually want to start not by talking about infrastructure, but by talking about the blind mole rat, which is a species mostly notable, as the name suggests, for being blind. What's interesting about the mole rat, it actually has eyes, but they're kind of completely encased in skin, what biologists call a vestigial feature. And biologists love vestigiality because it reveals a lot about where a species has been and how it evolved to be what it is today. And I got to thinking, well, we think about species like this, but we don't really think about cities in the same way. When we talk about cities, we think about the biggest and the brightest and the newest, right? Whether or not it's the Freedom Tower in New York or the Bay Bridge in San Francisco, or if it's something old, it's like the Eiffel Tower, right? It kind of dominates the landscape. But what I want to talk to you tonight about is all the interesting stories that you start to find when you start digging below the surface and looking at vestigial infrastructure in San Francisco. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories in the next 3 minutes, if I can. We'll see how this actually works out in practice. So first story. How many of you have seen these interesting kind of brick circles in intersections around San Francisco? Raise your hand if you have. So I had no idea what these were. See, everybody seems to have their own theory, like, oh, it's maybe connected to the rail car system or whatever. But it turns out, thanks to a local blogger, Burrito Justice, that we actually now know, who's awesome, we now know that there's actually huge underground cisterns below each one of these brick circles. You may be wondering, why in the world do we have these sorts of things? Yes, and it turns out that these cisterns are actually over 100 years old, and they're connected to a firefighting system that was built in the wake of the Great Fire of 1906. You see, one of the big problems was that we couldn't get water to where it was needed. There just wasn't enough pressure in the system. So after the fire, basically the city said, well, never again, and we're going to build a special system that's just connected and only for firefighting purposes. And actually, that system is still in effect. So if you look at fire hydrants around the city, you can see which ones are connected to this special system. So the ones with the blue tops that are a little bigger, these are connected to the 100-year-old system. The smaller white ones are connected to the domestic system that are basically used for all these other purposes. Actually, the bulb on top is actually used to tether horses. That's how old some of these fire hydrants are. Second story, the waterfront, actually. So it's not as fancy. It never always has been as fancy as it is. In fact, early in the city's history, ships kind of crowded into near where the Embarcadero is right now. And in fact, there were so many ships, and there were ships actually being abandoned as well, because people were abandoning these ships to go for the gold rush. And San Francisco eventually said, well, we need to actually build up this harbor. We actually have to build a professional waterfront. And what they did is actually, rather than remove all these ships in typical San Francisco style, we actually just built directly on top of all of them. So we're actually discovering now that the Embarcadero is actually this vast ship graveyard. And as we build more buildings, we're uncovering more and more ships. Actually, this is a map. You can recognize where the streets are and where we've actually been finding ships. Third interesting story. So some of you may be familiar with the War of Currents, a battle over whether or not AC current or DC current would be the format of the day. Long story short is that AC won, of course. It's the thing that most of our devices use. But what's intriguing is actually in the city of San Francisco, we actually still support about 900 customers that still use DC power. You can actually recognize them. They've got these special boxes, basically. A lot of them are on Market Street. And so you might be wondering, why do we have these sorts of things? Well, it turns out that we have vestigial infrastructure in the form of elevators, actually, that are more than 100 years old in these buildings, and they only work on DC power, and they're incredibly expensive to replace. So we've actually had no choice but to create this kind of vestigial grid in our more modern grid. So what do we take from all this? These are a bunch of interesting stories. Well, I think what it reveals is that most of the city is unseen. 90% of the city is unseen. And I think once you start scratching below the surface, you discover all these really interesting stories about where you live. And I think we should all try to do that. So here's my obligatory contact information. Thank you very, very much for your time.